Well, welcome. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Bland, your host for this Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute's educational program on nitric oxide, the molecule of the year in 1998. But so much clinical information research has amassed since that period of time. This makes it one of the more important clinical tools to really consider across a full range of phenotypic problems and clinical issues. We'll be exploring this in detail with two remarkable faculty, clinical expert and research experts. I have the luxury of being the person to lead off here and kind of set the tone for the discussion among the three of us. This is going to be 2 hours, I think, of intensive clinical, utilizable, and important information as it pertains to improving patient outcomes across a range of chronic conditions. So I think you'll find this well worth your time. And so with that in mind, let's move into our discussion, and I'll share my screen and we'll get on with the material at hand here. So going here quickly. Okay, so I've learned that in order to get this to work correctly, I need to change the format here. And I changed the format by going right here, hopefully. And here we go. Thank you for your patience. So let's talk about nitrates, nitric oxide, and their underleveraged role in healthy female aging with our two extraordinary faculty, Dr. Jill Carnahan, one of the top leading integrative functional medicine practitioners who is very skillful in women's health applications of nitric oxide, and Dr. Chris Easton, a researcher and exercise physiologist expert in the role of nitric oxide in human function. So we'll now take that story on into a greater understanding of its role in clinical practice. And so we're going to uncover the research role of nitric oxide in the human body. We're going to look at the connection of the nitric oxide levels to conditions experienced in the aging female. We'll be developing strategies to implement patient protocols to better assess menopausal symptoms and general female health and how nitric oxide plays roles, and then learn about effective ways to support nitric oxide levels throughout through the use of diet, lifestyle, and supplementation. And I want to thank Berkeley Life for their co-sponsorship of this program, along with the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute. They are an extraordinary company focused on the nitric oxide story and translating the latest research with integrity into clinical applications. So it's a great privilege to partner up with them in the production of this particular educational experience. For me, it all goes back to 1998, and the molecule of the year was nitric oxide, this small molecule, one nitrogen atom, one oxygen atom connected together with a molecular weight of 40 that was said at the time it could not possibly have all the effects that it's having in physiology. There's no way a small molecule like that could do all those things. But lo and behold, it was discovered by Dr. Farad Murad, Dr. Louis Ignarro, and Dr. Robert Funkrat, that in fact this small molecule is an important signaling agent across virtually every organ system in the body, and it regulates many, many functions that we're going to be talking about. And it can be modified through diet, lifestyle, and makes this a very, very important topic for personalized lifestyle intervention and therapeutics. I've had the privilege of knowing Dr. Ignarro and Dr. Murad quite well. In fact, Dr. Murad was a presenter at our 1998 Institute for Functional Medicine program. He had just won the Nobel Prize. That was in Aspen, Colorado. And Dr. Lou Ignarro, another co-recipient of the Nobel Prize for his discovery of nitric oxide, coming from UCLA, was a member of our scientific advisory board for a number of years. So these are individuals that I have great personal respect for, tremendous researchers, and birthed this field, the three of them with Dr. Fuscod, into something that you will see has applicability across so many different organs. We know that aging is associated with lowered nitric oxide output. And there are some people, as is suggested in this article that appeared in the Journal of the American Heart Association, that we're as old as our nitric oxide production, low nitric oxide production associated with prematurely aged individuals. So biological age is connected to nitric oxide production. And so I think that's a topic that was further reviewed in this overview of nitric oxide signaling pathways in aging and how they go down as disease risk and health. As disease risk goes up and health goes down, you see lowered nitric oxide production over a course of living. So we want to maintain good nitric oxide status is the theme and takeaway. And we know that in females that nitric oxide reductions are associated with endothelial dysfunction and increased female senescence. So I think, again, to introduce the gender specificity of nitric oxide, we know that nitric oxide is a very important signaling molecule in women throughout the full life cycle. And as we'll see, plays a role in pregnancy, plays a role in midlife, plays a role in menopause, and in older age, it cuts across to all periods of life. So what are the physiological effects of nitric oxide? Well, it is a whole laundry list that we associate clinically, and you're going to hear much more about this from the other faculty. But we know about cardiovascular effects due to the ability of nitric oxide to serve as a vasorelaxant in increasing oxygenation of tissues. It used to be thought that there was a protein that they called endothelial relaxing factor that did this, but it turns out it wasn't a protein. It was discovered by Dr. Murad and Dr. Agnaro that it was actually the small molecule nitric oxide. It has effects on the respiratory system. It improves oxygenation of tissues, improves lung function. It has immune system effects. It works as a powerful neurotransmission agent to help in mood, mind, memory, and behavior. It has effects on the gastrointestinal system, improving blood flow, mucosal protection by protecting the gastric mucosa from issues that are associated with dysbiosis. We all know about it with erectile dysfunction. Sildenafil that ultimately gave route to the whole lifestyle drug of erectile dysfunction medications that enhance production of nitric oxide and its vasodilatory effects, antimicrobial effects, wound healing effects, and now even recently effects of nitric oxide physiology in cancer. There are many nutrients that have been found to influence nitric oxide synthesis, including L-arginine. And we're going to talk a lot about nitrate-rich foods, so hold that for a moment. Antioxidants and many members of this family, but certainly the polyphenol phytochemical family, the flavonoids, are very, very important, as we'll talk about in nitric oxide production, and omega-3 fatty acids play an important role. We know about citrulline, the amino acid that's the byproduct of conversion of arginine to nitric oxide. It leaves citrulline. It's another amino acid that's been found to influence favorably nitric oxide levels. Coenzyme Q10, folate and the tetrahydrofolate cycle, and particularly the bioterins associated with the folate cycle, one of which you probably heard of, called tetrahydrobiopterin. We'll talk more about that in a moment. It's a very important cofactor for the nitric oxide synthase enzymes. All of these play roles in the production of nitric oxide. Well, there are many, many references that I could cite showing the role of nutrient supplementation and the ability to increase nitric oxide. This is just a few highlighted citations: dietary nitrate, improving nitric oxide, L-arginine supplementation, citrulline supplementation, effects of antioxidants, and omega-3 fatty acids. There are literally hundreds of papers that have been published over the last years on the role of various augmenting or precursor agents in enhancing nitric oxide production. Well, we know that there are 3 enzymes, all with the same name, that produce nitric oxide in different tissues. Those are members of the nitric oxide synthase, or NOS family. There's the endothelial nitric oxide synthase, there's the neuronal nitric oxide synthase, and then there's this immune-inducible form called INOS, immune-inducible nitric oxide synthase. I think this third one is very, very important because being inducible, it can be turned on and off by the environment. It's very sensitive to environmental agents, to the quality of diet, of lifestyle. If a person's in an inflammatory state, that influences it. So we know that these nitric oxide synthase enzymes are fed by arginine that then converts their arginine into nitric oxide. So just to remind you of the enzymatic connection to nitric oxide production. I already mentioned tetrahydrobiopterin, which is the cofactor for the nitric oxide synthase enzymes. And there are studies showing the supplementation with BH4 can enhance nitric oxide production, can enhance immune function, neurotransmission, vasodilation. And so we now recognize that this is another example of using a supplemental augmented, I guess you call it conditionally essential nutrient to influence favorably the downstream metabolite. In this case, it's nitric oxide that can be enhanced by BH4 supplementation. But there is another pathway for the production of nitric oxide that's been discovered recently that I think is the one that we want to really put at the forefront in terms of modulating nitric oxide production in the body. And this is the non-enzymatic production of nitric oxide, excuse me. And this comes from dietary sources of nitrate that get converted to nitrate, principally by various salivary microorganisms. After you eat, the nitrate gets converted to nitrite. Nitrite undergoes then this nitric oxide synthase independent pathway that becomes nitric oxide. So it's not just the NOS pathways that we used to think of, it's also the nitrate independent of NOS pathway that leads to enhanced nitric oxide. It's this latter route or pathway through dietary nitrate that is the most accessible in terms of increasing systemic nitric oxide output. It's the one that we will talk about in terms of clinical studies showing its benefit in enhancing nitric oxide. Are there concerns about excess nitric oxide? And of course, everything we know has some kind of a dose response curve, a safe, effective range of activity. So it's always a little is good, but too much is not good. So we know that there are cases where excessive nitric oxide has been associated with inflammatory disorders, exacerbation of certain types of autoimmune disorders, increased production of neurodegeneration as a consequence of oxidative stress occurring in the brain. At the same time, you have high activities of nitric oxide that combine to form a new highly corrosive chemical called peroxynitrite that I'm going to talk about. So it's everything in balance is what we're saying. Most people are insufficient, inadequate nitric oxide, so enhancing the production is considered beneficial. However, we want to be very clear that taken to the extreme, you can actually enhance inflammatory production by excessive nitric oxide, particularly as a consequence during oxidative stress situations of its reaction with ozone or hydrogen peroxide or oxidants that produces peroxynitrite. Peroxynitrite this could come from superoxide or hydrogen peroxide or ozone chemical reaction with nitric oxide. This does not require an enzyme. This is just a chemical reaction that occurs in cells that can produce this very corrosive secondary chemical called peroxynitrite. And it's been found to interact with the neuronal tissues and with the liver, and when produced in excessive quantities can cause tissue damage and DNA injury. So just to keep in mind, again, everything in balance, everything in the appropriate regulatory control. Well, what about women and the association of nitric oxide status with menopause? Well, there are many, many papers that are being published in this area, but the key message is menopause in and of itself is not necessarily a result of advancing age. But if you have a woman with low nitric oxide status that goes into menopause, it appears as if her symptoms are increased. She has a more problematic night sweats and sleep disturbances, And therefore, nitric oxide status is important for modulating hormonal regulation of processes in the women associated with perimenopause and menopause. We also know the placental vesicles carry active endothelial nitric oxide synthase, and their activity and low nitric oxide output is reduced in preeclampsia. So here's another example, in this case in pregnancy, to make sure you have appropriate nitric oxide production with the appropriate nitric oxide precursors in the diet. If we looked at the association, and the Nurses' Health Studies is looking in women in terms of their dietary nitrate intake and the association with a condition associated with intraocular pressure, glaucoma, open-angle glaucoma. So here's where you have poor vascular perfusion, vascular resistance, increased pressure in the eye, and glaucoma. And these are women who have lower dietary nitrate intake as associated in this study. And so the suggestion is increase in dietary nitrate may be associated with improved nitric oxide, lowered blood pressure, lower intraocular pressure, and lowered risk to glaucoma. That's from this study done at Harvard. So we know hormone replacement therapy is interrelated to plasma nitric oxide levels and an influence on postmenopausal symptoms. I had already mentioned that this is becoming more well understood, the interrelationship between the endocrine system and nitric oxide status in women, as well as obviously in men, when we talk about vasodilation and the effects on erection. So these things are really playing more and more important roles, the nitric oxide connection to reproductive biology and to women's health and men's health. So we'll hear more about this from our clinical study and discussion later. So could you use a vegetable juice that's high in nitrate to enhance nitric oxide output in pregnant animals and lower blood pressure? Interesting question, and the answer is yes. It's a controlled study looking actually at beetroot juice. Beetroot juice has fairly high nitrate levels, and it was found to lower blood pressure and improve endothelial function in these pregnant animals, and suggesting these nitrate-independent effects that are really important in regulating vascular tone. So is it just nitrate in beetroot juice, or are there other things? And I think this paper called into question that maybe it's not just the amount of nitrate alone that is associated with the lowered blood pressure and the lowered risk to disorders, but also the other things that come in this case a vegetable or a vegetable juice that may be synergizing agents for the production of nitric oxide. We'll talk about this because it really relates to the total dietary effect, not just nitrate in and of itself, but nitrate in combination with other nutrients that may synergistically help in nitric oxide formation. So what happens if you supplement with the nitric oxide precursors on strength performance? And there are many studies now. In fact, as I was reviewing the literature in 2023, there are nearly 100 studies, clinical trials already published this year looking at the effect of nitric oxide precursors like nitrate supplementation on improving strength and endurance performance. So this is a rapidly advancing field, and here's just one kind of data table that talks about various studies, clinical studies, what the size of the studies were, what the design, what the intervention was, and what their main findings of outcome were, looking in most of these cases at nitrate supplementation or nitrate along with amino acids, citrulline or arginine, and the positive influence on outcome in terms of the influence across different organ systems, everything from immune function to cognitive function to vascular function and respiratory function. Now, what happens if a person is consuming a high inflammatory diet? As you know, there are now ways of measuring the inflammation potential of a diet using questionnaires. So one can assess inflammatory index of the diet, and you could couple it together with clinical effects of a low nitric oxide production, like asthma. We now know that asthma is in part related to nitric oxide patency and sufficiency. So in this particular study, what they looked at was the correlation between the inflammatory index of the diet and clinical outcome in asthma, and correlated it with nitric oxide levels. And so it's really interesting because what they looked at was exhaled nitric oxide in the respiratory gases and correlated that as showing low nitric oxide exhaled in the high inflammation diet. But as a person went into an anti-inflammatory diet, that their nitric oxide in their breath went up and the clinical conditions of asthma were reduced. So again, it's not a one-to-one fit. It doesn't answer all questions, but it's certainly a very suggestive study indicating the positive role that nitric oxide precursors have on respiratory function, even in individuals with moderate to severe asthma. And I want to emphasize that if we look at the precursors, they're not talking about just dietary nitrate alone. They're talking about the whole complex of the anti-inflammatory diet, which then ties to this study on the Mediterranean diet and its association with the levels of serum nitric oxide and the formation of various types of pro-inflammatory prostaglandins, prostacyclin, and thromboxane B2, B4, in patients who have prinzmetal angina. So in this particular case, when they had a person adhere to a Mediterranean diet, their levels of serum nitric oxide went up, their levels of the pro-inflammatory prostaglandins went down, and their angina was improved. Now, again, this is not a pharmacological type of study. This is a dietary intervention association study, but I think it's still of reasonable size, 100 prinzmetal angina patients and against 100 healthy controls. So you did have a control group, and you showed a statistically significant improvement in angina associated with the adherence to the Mediterranean diet, which is richer in nitrate, but it's also richer in many other vegetable-derived nutrients that play positive roles. I would call it synergistic roles in the production of nitric oxide, and ultimately how that tracks in reduction of angina. So it's really an interesting clinical takeaway. What about calorie restriction and its effect on metabolic function? In this case, looking at both vascular and cognitive functions in overweight adults. So calorie restriction, we know, has a number of studies showing that it improves cognitive and vascular functions, particularly in individuals with high BMIs. But in this case, they had two arms of the study, those who were calorie restricted and those who were calorie restricted, who then supplemented with nitrate from beetroot juice. And they then examined the outcomes between the two in a 14-day randomized controlled trial. The results of the study were quite interesting. Let me just take you through quickly. The dark bars, the black bars, are related to the baseline levels, and the gray bars are the final levels. So you've got the group that's calorie controlled or calorie restricted with and without beetroot juice. And what you basically find is that, as you might expect, salivary nitrate goes up in the intervention group, but salivary nitrate goes up only in the group with beetroot juice. So there's a higher level of production of the precursors to nitric oxide in the beetroot juice. We also recognize the urinary nitrate goes up, but most importantly, is in the beetroot juice group versus the calorie restricted group alone, you had a significant reduction in isoprostanes that are associated with vascular inflammation and lowered vascular performance. That was the lower right data set showing that the reduction with calorie restriction plus beetroot juice led to a significant, statistically significant reduction in isoprostane, whereas those that were on calorie restriction alone without the beetroot juice did not have that reduction. So again, showing synergy and showing important roles of a couple of different intervention tools, one being calorie restriction and the other now adding the beetroot juice with nitrate. We know that other fruit juices in this cases can also increase nitric oxide, even though they have very low levels of nitrate. This is an interesting trial looking at watermelon juice. This was done at the Pennington Institute at the Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, showing that watermelon juice had a favorable effect on heart rate variability, on metabolic response in an oral glucose tolerance test, and increased nitric oxide output, even though there was a very little amount of either the precursors to nitric oxide, L-arginine and L-citrulline, at very low levels of nitrate. The consequence of the synergistic nature of all the substances present in watermelon led to a significant reduction in these these variables that associate themselves with improved vascular function. Well, what are the nitrate and nitrate quantities in fruit and fruit juice? So watermelon, you notice, is only about 26.6 milligrams per liter of nitrate. Cantaloupe is a little higher at 59, but all of these fruit and vegetable juices are fairly low levels of nitrate. If you go in comparison to beetroot juice, which has 11,000 milligrams of nitrate per liter versus say 30, you can see it's a couple of orders of magnitude different. So certainly beetroot juice is far and away a higher contributor of nitrate, but these other juices are found to have favorable effects on nitric oxide formation, which may be going beyond that of just nitrate alone. So could there be a positive impact on nitric oxide in fruits and vegetables that are due to synergistic effects with nitrate that take us beyond that of nitrate itself? It's a very, very interesting question, and the answer appears to be yes, because even if we look at pomegranate extract juice, which is very low in nitrate, in supplementing high-intensity exercisers, it's found to improve blood flow, improve vessel diameter, and improve nitric oxide production. So this argues very strongly when you're thinking clinically about a complex diet and all the variables that influence nitric oxide production, nitrate being very important, but in the presence of various polyphenols, flavonoids. So what is the dietary polyphenol impact on plasma nitric oxide? So this is another recent paper published in The Lancet that looked at the Prediment study. This is the Mediterranean diet study, and the effects of total dietary polyphenols on plasma nitric oxide and blood pressure in a subgroup in the Prediment study of high cardiovascular risk individuals, showing that effects of one-year intervention with a traditional Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil or nuts resulted in a significant reduction of blood pressure and an increase in nitric oxide. There was total polyphenol excretion was significantly correlated with plasma nitric oxide, and Mediterranean diets therefore may decrease blood pressure due to the high polyphenol consumption that is associated with enhanced nitric oxide output. So I want to emphasize the synergistic effect of all these dietary variables that plays a positive role in enhancing nitric oxide. So we know now, and as I mentioned, the studies are coming out very, very rapidly, the clinical intervention trials. This is a meta-analysis, the effects of dietary nitrate supplementation on bench press performance and showing strength and endurance in the systematic review is enhanced by the supplementation with nitrate. So it is certainly showing its clinical benefit. Another study of this type, and the many that are being published, this is in the randomized control of an elite football team. In this case, I'm not talking about American football. This is European football soccer. So in this professional soccer group of athletes, the effect of nitrate supplementation was to significantly improve aerobic potential and endurance and performance. So, and this is about 300 milligrams higher dietary nitrate than a control kind of low dietary nitrate group. So I think we're starting to see clinical proof of putting studies demonstrating benefit. It's not the be all and end all. It doesn't treat all problems, but it's certainly something of major concern, particularly with the number of people that are nitric oxide insufficient. So with that in mind, we're ready to move to our wonderful clinical and research experts. I thank you for your kind tolerance of my introduction, and we'll now move and stay with us now for the next hour and a half, because we're going to come back with our faculty with a panel discussion at the end. It's always very enriching, enhancing. So hang tough. I think you're going to get a big dividend for being through to the end of the program. Thanks so much. Now we'll get on with our clinical mastery.
Hi, my name is Chris Easton. I'm a Professor of Exercise Physiology at the University of the West of Scotland. It's my great pleasure to be speaking with you today about nitrates, nitric oxide, and their under-leveraged role in healthy female ageing. So just to give you a brief overview of the topic of my presentation, I'm going to speak about the importance of nitric oxide for human health and performance. I'll talk a little bit about how nitric oxide is produced in the human body and how ageing and exercise can influence its production. We'll talk about why you really should eat your vegetables, and that is a focus on the role of dietary nitrate and production of nitric oxide via the dietary nitrate pathway. And lastly, I'll touch on environmental effects on nitric oxide production, specifically on sunlight. But before beginning, I just want to give you a brief introduction to who I am and what I do. My research in the early stages of my academic career really focused on trying to understand why certain athletes were so good at what they do. So for example, the Ethiopians and the Kenyans in their distance running performance. My work is also focused on the benefits of exercise and physical activity interventions in a wide variety of different populations, including in children. But for the most part, my work is focused on how we can leverage nutrition to help athletes optimize their exercise performance. So it was with great interest I read the study published by Andy Jones's group in 2009. We showed that drinking a pint of beetroot juice every day for 7 days increased exercise performance by 16% on average. Now, I find this absolutely fascinating given the small margins between which gold medals are won or lost. So I really wanted to try and understand more about what was underpinning this performance effect. And in the paper, the authors described that the body is capable of converting nitrate that's found in green leafy vegetables such as beetroots to something called nitric oxide. Now I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that mechanism is in a few slides time, but what I wanted to do is just emphasize where my interest in nitric oxide really began. Now, believe it or not, nitric oxide was generally considered to be merely an atmospheric pollutant up until the 1980s, where the research work of 3 different groups discovered that nitric oxide is produced by endothelial cells in smooth muscle and was responsible for smooth muscle relaxation and therefore had a really important regulatory role in blood pressure. That discovery was deemed so important that the leads for these research groups were awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1998. And since then, our knowledge and understanding of the role of nitric oxide in human physiology has grown exponentially. And on the slide, you can see a summary of the physiological, biochemical, and on occasion pathological functions that nitric oxide has. We can see nitric oxide's important regulatory role in reproduction, in the cardiovascular system, in the neurological system, and on our immune function. So the takeaway from this is that maintaining nitric oxide levels is absolutely crucial for human health. So let's look at how the body actually produces nitric oxide. And it does so by converting the semi-essential amino acid L-arginine to nitric oxide in the presence of oxygen. And the enzymes responsible for converting the arginine to nitric oxide are called nitric oxide synthases. And there are 3 different forms of these nitric oxide synthases in the body. Now, nitric oxide itself is an inherently unstable molecule, and very quickly after it's produced, it can be oxidized to the more stable storage forms such as nitrite, NO2, and nitrate, NO3. Now here's the bad news. Our ability to produce nitric oxide declines with age, and for anyone like me over the age of 40, our production of nitric oxide has actually declined to about 50% of where it was in our teenage years. So this may be particularly relevant in ageing women, as I'll come on to explain. So firstly, really important to mention that the production of estrogen increases nitric oxide synthase, leading to nitric oxide production, and you can see the cellular mechanisms responsible for this on that slide. Now, as women age, they produce less estrogen, and on the right hand side you can see the fall in estradiol, an isoform of estrogen, on the blue line there, falling quite considerably as a woman goes through their menopause. So this falling production in estrogen likely explains why we see this sudden exponential rise in cardiovascular disease as women age, because they are producing a lot less nitric oxide. But here's the good news. It is possible to reduce some of this age-related decline in nitric oxide production, and one of the ways that we can do this is through exercise. So this is a study undertaken with rats, and broadly speaking it shows that nitric oxide production can be enhanced by undertaking regular exercise. So this first bar here is a group of young sedentary rats, and this is the level of nitric oxide synthase expression. And the next bar along is from a group of young rats that were exercising regularly, and you can see that exercise itself results in a significant increase in nitric oxide synthase expression. The next bar along here is a group of older sedentary rats, and the next bar along here is a group of exercising older rats. And again, we're talking about nitric oxide synthase expression here. And you can see that by increasing exercise and activity levels in this aging population, they've managed to increase their nitric oxide synthase expression to a level that was similar to that younger, albeit sedentary group. And one of the other ways that we can produce nitric oxide is through the diet. A few slides ago I talked about beetroot juice and the body's ability to convert the nitrate to nitric oxide. So let me take you through that pathway in a little more detail. So when root vegetables like beetroot or green leafy vegetables like lettuce are grown in the soil, they absorb nitrate, signified by the green circles on the slide there. When it's not appropriate or when it's not convenient to do so, we may also extract that nitrate and provide it in capsule form, like those provided by Berkeley Life. When we ingest the nitrate, if you follow the green circle down, you'll see that it's absorbed into our circulation, and then it re-enters the mouth via the enterosalivary circulation. So it's excreted by the salivary glands back into the oral cavity. And here's where the really amazing process happens. Because there are certain species of bacteria that live inside the mouth, predominantly on the surface of the tongue, that are capable of reducing the nitrate NO3 to NO2. So you can see the colour of the circle is now changed to blue. When we swallow the nitrite and it enters the acidic conditions of the stomach, the body is then capable of further reducing the nitrite to nitric oxide, and you can see the circle is now changed to black. So where that nitrite encounters hypoxic or conditions of low pH, the body is capable of converting that to nitric oxide. And it's really important to note at this point that this pathway is oxygen independent. So in the table you can see some good sources of dietary nitrate. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, this is generally green leafy and root vegetables. So things like celery, cress, lettuce and beetroot. And for those of you who are old enough to remember the cartoon Popeye, you'll recollect that he used to eat a big can of spinach before going off to fight his enemies. Now, as it happens, spinach actually has a really high content of nitrate, so perhaps Popeye really did have a good physiological rationale for this dietary intervention. So I'm going to go on now and talk about some of the work that my research group has undertaken in the last few years, looking at the impact of dietary nitrate supplementation on markers of health and exercise performance. But before I do, I just want to remind you of something I said earlier on, which is nitric oxide is inherently unstable. And this poses a real challenge for those of us working in this field, because we can't actually measure the molecule in biological fluids that we're interested in. So generally speaking, what we can do is we measure the storage forms, and for example, nitrite or nitrate. So in our lab, we will generally collect blood samples where we can then centrifuge the blood, extract the plasma, and measure the concentration of nitrite as a marker of nitric oxide availability. But given the role of the microbiome, the bacteria that reside in our mouth, commonly we'll also collect saliva samples as well. And while we can process those in our laboratory, it's a very time-consuming and expensive method to measure nitrate concentration. So fortunately, Berkeley produced these test strips that you can buy and provide an instantaneous measure of nitrite concentration in the saliva. So a much more rapid way to determine nitric oxide availability. So just to give you a general sense of what happens when we ingest a source of dietary nitrate, well, what you can see on the screen here is the change in salivary nitrite and nitrate on the left-hand side, and plasma nitrite and nitrate on the right-hand side. And if you look at the two graphs at the bottom, you can see the change in nitrate in the saliva and the blood, and you can see that the increase is fairly rapid as we ingest and then absorb the nitrate firstly into circulation and then back into the oral cavity. And then the conversion of nitrate to nitrite takes place inside the mouth, and so the production or release of nitrite into the circulation takes a little bit longer with this additional step. I'm not going to dwell too much on the therapeutic applications of dietary nitrate supplementation in my webinar presentation, but it's safe to say there are myriad benefits of nitrate to human health. The most well established is the effects of nitrate supplementation on blood pressure. This is some work from our group here, and you can see that in this case we gave participants either nitrate-rich beetroot juice or a nitrate-rich gel using Swiss chard extract. And you can see that in both cases there was a significant decline in systolic blood pressure. We think almost certainly this is a consequence of the nitrate being converted to nitric oxide, resulting in smooth muscle relaxation and a reduced blood pressure. In the last few years, my group's become really interested in the role of the oral microbiome. These bacteria that reside in the oral cavity and are responsible for reducing the nitrate to nitrite, allowing that further conversion to nitric oxide. So the first question then is, how important are the microbiome in this process? And the answer is absolutely crucial. So you can see in the graph there, the middle bar shows what happens when we ingest nitrate-rich beetroot juice. We see a significant increase in plasma nitrite concentration compared to the control. And the third bar shows what happens when we still give participants beetroot juice, but before that we use a strong antibacterial mouthwash to kill the bacteria that live inside the mouth. And you can see that when we do that, we get no increase in plasma nitrite. So effectively we're completely blocking that reduction of nitrate to nitrite and therefore reducing the potential to generate nitric oxide through this dietary pathway. And in many of the studies that we do at the moment, what we'll typically do is collect samples of the bacteria on the surface of the tongue by taking a tongue scrape and then isolating the DNA of those bacterial samples. And this allows us firstly to quantify what species of bacteria are there, but then begin to look more closely at the relative abundance of those bacterial species, or indeed the activity. And the advantage of this is we can start then to look at the association between the abundance of these bacterial species and relevant physiological outcomes. So for example, this is some work we published a few years ago now, where we quantified the abundance of these nitrate reducing bacterial species. And we divided their participants into two groups, those who had a high abundance of these nitrate reducing bacteria and participants who had a lower abundance of these nitrate reducing bacteria. We then gave the participants a nitrate source. In this case, again, it was beetroot juice, and we measured what happened to the salivary nitrate and nitrite values. So you can see in the graph on the bottom right of the slide here that there were no difference in salivary nitrate. And really that's just reflecting the absorption of the nitrate into the circulation and that nitrate re-entering the mouth. On the other hand, if you look at the graph in the top right, you can see that there's a significant difference in salivary nitrite. And those with a higher abundance of those bacteria were able to produce more nitrite and to do that faster, likely because they have more of the bacteria present, which are able to reduce the nitrate to nitrite. So one of the other advantages to quantifying the oral microbiome in this way is that we can apply different stimuli and look at what happens to the proportion of these nitrate reducing bacteria. So this is one example from our group, and in this case we gave participants nitrate rich beetroot juice for 1 week, and following a washout period we gave them a nitrate depleted beetroot juice, so a placebo form, and we quantified the abundance of nitrate reducing species inside the mouth. And you can see on the right hand side here the data, or some of the data. Firstly, the 2 bars show pre and post nitrate supplementation, and the 3rd and 4th bars show pre and post placebo supplementation. So up the top there you can see the abundance of Neisseria subflava. It's a nitrate reducing bacterial species that is generally associated with good oral health. And in this case we found that the both forms of beetroot juice increased the abundance, but the increase was much more substantial following the nitrate rich beetroot juice supplementation. In the bottom right you can see the abundance of Prevotella melaningica. Now this species of bacteria is generally considered to have pathogenic effects. We know it's one of the species, for example, that produces acid as a result of their metabolism. Now interestingly, what we found was that firstly, nitrate rich beetroot juice significantly reduced the abundance of this bacterial species. But secondly, when we measured the pH of the saliva, we found that the pH actually increased as a result of the nitrate supplementation. So this was our first indication that perhaps nitrate supplementation was beneficial not only for cardiovascular health, but also for oral health as well. And we've since followed that up with another study where we were interested in the context of athletes who are subject to quite significant risk of oral disease, mainly as a consequence of their frequent ingestion of carbohydrates. Now this study was undertaken in healthy male runners, but we've no reason to expect any difference in female athletes as well. And what we found was that, unsurprisingly, when you ingest a carbohydrate sports drink, a Powerade or a Gatorade, we see a significant decline and rapid decline in salivary pH. The saliva very quickly becomes more acidic. However, when you ingest beetroot juice or other nitrate form prior to the measurements, you can see that again salivary pH is significantly increased, and this is the purple line on the graph here. So again, further evidence that nitrate supplementation seems to be beneficial for our oral health. Now, given the importance of the oral microbiome in nitric oxide performance, the next steps are, for us anyway, to begin to explore and unravel all the different factors that may influence the composition of the oral microbiome. So things that we are responsible for, our diet, our exercise, our oral hygiene habits, and also things that are maybe more implicit, genetics, ethnicity, immune system, salivary flow rate, and so on. So clearly, given the links between the oral microbiome and systemic health, this research, I think, will become really important. So let's move on to talk about exercise then. And I mentioned my interest in sport and exercise science research at the outset of the presentation. And generally speaking, nitrate supplementation has been shown to have a beneficial effect on exercise performance. This is one example from my own research group where we compared nitrate with a placebo. And on the left-hand side, you can see that the time required to complete a 10-mile cycling time trial was significantly improved after the nitrate supplementation. Now, it's important to note that this study was undertaken in simulated altitude. And this is important because, as I mentioned earlier, the conversion of nitrite to nitric oxide is increased in conditions of hypoxia and acidosis. So it may be that the impact of nitrate supplementation on performance is particularly pronounced in altitude. But it's not just about the competition, of course, and for those of us who are undertaking regular exercise, we may also be interested in how we get the most out of our training sessions. And some work from our group has shown that when you combine sprint interval training, very high intensity exercise, with nitrate supplementation, then you get a kind of double whammy effect. So the adaptations to the exercise training are particularly pronounced when you precede the exercise training sessions with dietary nitrate supplementation. So what are the possible physiological mechanisms for these ergogenic effects of nitrate? Well, one of the initial suggestions was perhaps it was about muscle blood flow, so increasing blood flow to the muscle during exercise. And while there is some evidence of this in animal models, the evidence in humans is lacking. Instead, we think that it's more to do with the muscle contraction process itself. And there's work from different groups which has shown both an enhanced mitochondrial efficiency, so reducing the amount of oxygen used per ATP molecule produced, or also reducing the ATP cost of muscle force production. One of the other suggestions that may be particularly relevant for endurance training or exercise training more generally is that nitrate has been shown in some cases to increase the expression of calcium handling proteins, which in effect results in the muscle being able to produce more force. So just to summarise the overall picture of the nitrate supplementation and exercise performance field, this is some data from a systematic review and meta-analyses where they collated all the different findings from the various studies. And you can see on the right hand side of the conclusions, which is that there was a clear ergogenic effect of nitrate supplementation on exercise performance in recreationally active young healthy men. You can see on the graph, the third bar along shows the data from women-only studies, and you can see there's a real dearth of research which is focused on the effects of nitrate in women. Another important point to raise here is that nitrate supplementation doesn't seem to be as effective in very fit individuals, so elite athletes, for example. And this may be because they already have very high levels of nitric oxide as a result of their exercise training. So why is it an issue then that the research does not contain studies that are focused on women? Well, it is a real issue because there are some inherent physiological differences between men and women, which means that women may not respond to nitrate supplementation in the same way that men do. I mentioned earlier on about the effects of the menstrual cycle and the effects of menopause on endogenous nitric oxide production. So it stands to reason that there will be inherent variability in the response to dietary nitrate supplementation as well. So anatomical differences, physiological, metabolic differences between men and women need to be explored and with more rigorous and robust studies done with women only. So those of you who are interested in learning more about the effects of dietary nitrate supplementation on exercise performance are directed to this Delphi study, which I contributed to along with a global consortium of experts in the dietary nitrate field. And in this piece of work, we summarised the state of play of the existing research, highlighting some key recommendations for practice and future directions. I just want to turn your attention to one of those future directions, where we suggest that undertaking more work to look at the effects of nitrate in different environmental conditions is likely to be important. And this is just one example of why undertaking work in different environmental conditions is important, because we know the skin has really large stores of nitric oxide metabolites. And one of the ways that we can release those metabolites into the circulation is by shining ultraviolet light, such as that typically found in sunlight. In some work from our lab, where we used an ultraviolet lamp inside the laboratory to provide a controlled dose of UV radiation to our participants, we measured the effect of this exposure on nitric oxide availability, and we found that when you expose the skin to sufficient dose, which is typically representative of about half an hour of sunlight in the summer sunshine in the Mediterranean, you see a significant increase in nitric oxide availability. So what's the implications of this then? Well, firstly, where we live is important. So the closer to the equator, the more ultraviolet radiation we will typically be exposed to. But also thinking about the time of year as well, because we know that change in the ultraviolet radiation exposure from sunlight is going to be subject to the seasons. So we wanted to explore more about what impact the time of year had on our nitric oxide availability. So we worked with Public Health England to undertake a piece of research which focused on healthy adults living in central Scotland. And we found that in the winter months, participants had a much lower level of vitamin D compared to the summer. And you probably know a little bit about vitamin D. We know that sunlight exposure is one of the primary ways in which we can generate vitamin D in the body. And we know that low levels of vitamin D is associated with a number of different disease risks. So this finding alone certainly is not novel. But what is novel is that we showed for the first time that nitric oxide levels were also significantly lower in the winter months compared to the summer months as well. And given everything I've said up until this point, we can already begin to see the potential implications of this for health and also exercise performance. As an example, in this study, and again others have shown this too, systolic blood pressure was significantly higher in the winter compared to the summer, and that's perhaps no surprise given the impact on our nitric oxide availability. So we were really interested in trying to understand what happens if you combined dietary nitrate with UV exposure. And in this study here, we had a control condition, which you can see on the first bar, ultraviolet light, which is the second bar, dietary nitrate alone, which is the third bar, and then a combination of nitrate and UV light together. And the graph that you can see shows the change in plasma nitrite concentration, again approximating our nitric oxide availability. And you can see that when we combine the nitrate and the ultraviolet light together, we saw the largest increase in nitric oxide. Interestingly, we also measured the impact on exercise performance, and we found the only condition that actually improved exercise performance was the combination of nitrate and UV light. So just to finish with a brief summary and take-home message then, well, hopefully I've convinced you that maintaining levels of nitric oxide is crucial for both health and exercise performance. And while nitric oxide levels decline with age, importantly, in women, likely as a consequence or partly as a consequence of their menopause, and we can combat this through exercise, through the diet, and by exposing the skin to sunlight. Clearly, there's more work that needs to be undertaken, particularly in women, to try and understand the under-leveraged role of nitrate and nitric oxide in healthy female ageing. And just to finish, as I always do, with my acknowledgements, so particularly to funding sources and most importantly to the PhD students and postdocs from my lab that have been responsible for producing a lot of the work that I've spoken about today. Thanks for your interest.
Well, hello everyone. It's Dr. Jill Carnahan from Louisville, Colorado, where I practice functional medicine. Tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about how nitric oxide can support healthy aging in women, a topic near and dear to my heart. And I think by the end of my presentation, you will find how critical this concept really is to really any patient that you see, including men and women who are aging. So how can nitric oxide support healthy aging in women? I hope to answer that question for you tonight. First, we'll describe the role of nitric oxide in healthy signaling and endothelial function. Then we'll discuss how loss of nitric oxide production leads to many chronic diseases, including diabetes, stroke, cognitive decline, decreased sexual function, and many more. And then we'll learn the most effective methods of raising nitric oxide production. So let's start with key steps to healthy aging. We know that diet, exercise, avoiding environmental toxins, controlling stress, adequate sleep, we all know these things, but I would love to add to the list, maintaining healthy nitric oxide levels could be crucial to men and women as we age. So why does nitric oxide production really matter? Well, we know that cardiovascular risk starts to outpace men in women after menopause. We know that nitric oxide production dramatically declines with age. I'll show you a chart, but we decline by about 40% after the age of 40 and up to 85% after the age of 65. Nitric oxide is critical to healthy blood flow, endothelial function, and it affects every organ. And now, especially post-pandemic, we're seeing more and more endothelial dysfunction, and I really feel like this topic could be a critical solution to some of the ongoing long COVID and chronic complex cases that we're seeing. Nitric oxide is key for healthy cognition with aging, and it improves sexual response in women. So here is the chart where you can see around the age of 40, men start to decline. And then when women catch up after menopause, they start to decline as well. So women are just slightly behind men in decline in nitric oxide, and that usually relates to the hormone changes with menopause. But both of them catch up around the age of 60 and are as low as 10 to 15% of production that they were in their 20s. And so you can see the critical importance of the endothelial dysfunction, because as we lose nitric oxide, we have the plaque adherence to the endothelial lining and heart attack, stroke, lack of oxygenation, poor sexual function, poor brain function. And you could name any organ that needs blood flow, which is all of them, and it could be related to a decline in nitric oxide. So what are early signs of nitric oxide deficiency? Loss of nitric oxide is the earliest event in the onset of many chronic, if not most chronic diseases. It starts with elevated blood pressure. That's one of the early signs. Sexual dysfunction, so erectile dysfunction in men, and anorgasmia, trouble with orgasm in women. Insulin resistance, who knew? It's also related to poor nitric oxide production, exercise intolerance, and memory disturbances, so early cognitive decline. So there's a perfect storm for nitric oxide. These are the things that start to decrease our nitric oxide production. One of them is just being over the age of 40, as you saw with our diagram. Physical inactivity, because physical activity increases nitric oxide production. Standard American diet, we want nitrite-rich foods, which is leafy greens and root vegetables and things that are grown in the soil. And our standard American diet is deficient in those kinds of foods. There's many medications that decrease nitric oxide production. Antidepressants, as you know, SSRIs, one of their mechanism of decreasing libido is actually through decreased nitric oxide production. So that's a big one. Antibiotics, antifungals. Now, antibiotics, antifungals affect the microbiome. And as I'll show you in a moment, the microbiome, especially in our mouth, actually is one of the ways that we produce nitrates from nitrites. So really critical to have that healthy microbiome in both our mouth and our gut. NSAIDs, oral contraceptives, proton pump inhibitors. We decrease that production of stomach acid, low stomach acid, antiseptic mouthwash. So this is a big one because as we're sterilizing the bacteria in our mouth, that's where the nitrites are produced. And so as we use more fluoride toothpaste and mouthwash, we're sterilizing that microbiome that creates more nitric oxide. So really critical that we stop our addiction to mouthwash. Glyphosate, pollution, EMF, stress, and I could go on about all the environmental toxins. All of this is affecting our nitric oxide production and just our age. So very critical to take this into account in our patients and especially women around the age of menopause and beyond. So these are the factors, some of the ones that affect. We said aging, of course, diet, exercise. We talked about medication, suppression of stomach acid, environmental toxins. And I wanted to just mention genetics like SOD, catalase, heme, SNPs, INOS, anything that decreases the ability to produce biopterin or BH4. What happens when there is not enough BH4, the NOS enzyme is uncoupled and it produces superoxide instead of nitric oxide, creating more reactive oxygen, which is more inflammatory. So for some of those people that we're giving arginine that have a lot of oxidative stress, we actually may be producing more superoxide and oxidative species and not nitric oxide like we anticipate. So I'm just postulating one of the most important things we can do for healthy aging is to enhance the body's ability to make nitric oxide. So it all starts with the endothelium, the lining of our vessels all over our entire body that bring oxygen to the tissues. Obviously, it supports all of or covers all of our luminous surfaces, blood vessels, lymphatics. It's the largest metabolically active organ in the body. It produces vasoactive substances to maintain tone and regulate blood flow. And basically, endothelial function comes when we cannot produce nitric oxide. And this is much bigger, dangerous route of cardiovascular disease and stroke risk than pure cholesterol numbers, right? Because it's the cholesterol that starts to get sticky and sticks to a damaged endothelial lining that's not producing nitric oxide that really is the mix of the problem. And as we already know, it's actually oxidized LDL that's the problem, not just pure LDL. As long as nitric oxide synthase is coupled, we have normal endothelial function. But when we have oxidative stress, which is all those things, radiation, environmental toxins, mold, PPIs, drugs, all the stuff I mentioned before, lack of sleep, lack of oxygen, obstructive sleep apnea, any of these things that affect our ability to oxygenate, we can have oxidative stress leading to nitric oxide uncoupling, which actually creates more reactive oxygen. So nitric oxide, what is it? It's a gas. It's only around for seconds. It's a signaling molecule. It controls inflammation. It controls stem cells to site of injury. It controls oxygenation to tissues. So it's a master regulator in the body and absolutely key for good health and longevity. So what's the big deal? We talked about some of these things. It regulates cardiovascular function and homeostasis. Red blood cells require nitric oxide to deliver oxygen to the cells. It supports neurotransmitter function, so creation of norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, oxytocin, regulates gastrointestinal function. I'll talk a little bit about that, how it prevents leaky gut. It helps activate the GLUT4 receptor, which allows the body to signal glucose into cells. It's essential for learning and memory and supports telomerase activity, which leads to longevity and healthier cells as well. It also controls generation of mitochondrial energy production. So at the mitochondrial level, our energy production is affected by appropriate nitric oxide levels. Stem cell mobilization and differentiation. It regulates the immune system. It decreases mast cell activation. It regulates inflammatory response and scavenges free radicals. It modifies platelet activation and aggregation, and prolactin and glucocorticoids, so stress hormones, especially with the glucocorticoids, will uncouple nitric oxide. So this is the intrinsic and extrinsic nitric oxide production pathways. On the left, you see arginine plus oxygen and nitric oxide synthase can produce nitric oxide. A lot of our supplements contain arginine as a precursor for hormone health and male hormone sexual function to create more nitric oxide. However, if there is oxidative stress, this will be uncoupled and actually create more harm than good. So on the intrinsic path on the right, you can see that diet with rich in nitrate-rich foods like beets and celery and bok choy and spinach all will produce through the bacterial reductases in the salivary gland, in the mouth, produce nitrites, which are then converted into nitric oxide. So one takeaway here is stop using mouthwash. I'll tell you, as I dove into the research on nitric oxide and really realized I have some natural mouthwash kinds of products I've used, but I really rethought my use of mouthwash after this presentation because I really want that healthy microbiome in my mouth so that I can convert nitrates to nitrites and into nitric oxide through the foods that we consume. So this is the NADPH oxidase, the NOx enzyme that it's normally dormant, but it's activated in the case of oxidative stress. So this is where those exposures to glyphosate and mold and EMFs and toxic chemicals and poor diet and lack of sleep, we have an increase in NADPH oxidase or NOx enzyme, increasing superoxide and oxidative stress. This is where we could oxidize the LDL, we oxidize our membranes, we create all kinds of reactive oxygen. It's activated by mTOR, by histamine, by oxalates, by aluminum, smoking, high homocysteine, sulfites, LPS, that would be our bacterial coatings in our gut, dopamine, RAS, pro-inflammatory cytokines, mold, chronic infections, EMF, excess iron, and excess glutamic acid or glutamate. So all of these things can actually activate NADPH oxidase, increasing the oxidative stress that's created. Instead of the healthy nitric oxide being produced, it creates superoxide. Glyphosate also will uncouple NOx. So all of these things in our environment, one of the reasons why they're so toxic is because they uncouple uncouple the nitric oxide and create this oxidative stress. This is just a diagram of the NOx uncoupling, oxidative stress, diabetic pathology, lipid peroxides, low biopterin status, phosphorylation status can all uncouple the enzyme, the NOx uncoupling, which leads to reactive oxygen instead of the healthy nitric oxide that we desire. So if you haven't seen my YouTube channel, this is a great lecture with Bob Miller where we go into all the pathways on the NOx enzyme and all the things that trigger that. So if you haven't seen that, it's on my YouTube channel for free, Understanding NOx Pathways. And this is a vicious cycle of inflammation because what happens is we get this increased reactive oxygen produced by NADPH, stimulates the RAS, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, creates hypertension, cognitive and memory decline, cardiometabolic diseases, impaired kidney function, impaired thyroid function, leaky gut, obesity. As you can see, it really affects a lot of tissues and systems. And one last slide on this, the effects of nitrates and oxidative stress. So when we have dietary nitrates going into nitrites through the bacterial metabolism in our mouth, we can produce nitric oxide. And that is if we have enough precursors. But that will actually decrease reactive oxygen. This is ideally how it works. But if the NOx enzyme gets uncoupled, then we have oxidative stress. And we just talked about all of the ways and all the things in our environment that can do that. Okay, so now let's shift to the solution, especially in menopause. Like, why might we want more nitric oxide? We heard all the bad news when it's uncoupled, how not to use mouthwash anymore. Let's move on to the importance in aging. So I showed you this before, just to remind you, basically, that women have a curve very similar to a man's curve in decreased production as we age, and it pretty dramatically goes down after the age of 50. It actually starts in our 40s. So common symptoms of menopause: cognitive impairment, the brain fog, hot flashes, night sweats, urogenital symptoms, decreased sexual arousal and lubrication, and insomnia. Nitric oxide can help many of these. So in menopause, nitric oxide regulates hormone release. It triggers pulsatile release of LH-RH, which mediates luteinizing hormone release. And that is the way that we stimulate production of steroid hormones through the ovaries. Now, when the ovaries decline in production, of course, they usually come from adrenal sources, but this pathway is important as we approach menopause and beyond. Estrogen declines with age, and as a result, the ENOS function after menopause, as you saw on the chart just a few slides ago, dramatically declines. 80% of US women are hypertensive after the age of 85, and that is all related to low nitric oxide production. I shouldn't say all, they're never all or never right, most of the time related to decreased nitric oxide production. So estradiol, progesterone, DHEA all support ENOS. Progesterone acts directly on epithelial cells of the endometrium to stimulate expression of ENOS and increase nitric oxide production. And typically menopausal women are starting to decline of progesterone first, and then later estradiol. And both of these lead to decreased ENOS production of nitric oxide as we age. Testosterone deficiency induces endothelial dysfunction as well, and this deficiency can lead to lack of arousal and anorgasmia. And testosterone regulates nitric oxide cyclic GMP pathway, which directly influences endothelial function and repair. So all these hormones, which start to dramatically decline in menopause, have a dramatic effect on nitric oxide production as well. Nitric oxide, what is it involved in? We've talked about some of these things: enhanced learning and creation of long-term memory, promotion of neuronal survival and neuroplasticity. This is also all about brain health, neuroprotective actions of BDNF, increased production of GABA and decreased anxiety, meditation, our REM sleep, so mediation, of REM sleep. So this will actually increase our REM sleep, which increases the ability of BDNF to be produced in the evening. And it blocks excessive production of cortisol, which typically increases as we age. And nitrates will also increase the production of biopterin. So nitric oxide production declines with age. We've already mentioned this, decreases to 50% by the time we're 40 and 15% by the time we're 60. It's all about blood flow. So, very important topic, female sexual health and aging. Sexual desire obviously starts in the brain, but the sex organs rely on neurotransmitters and hormones to promote libido and changes in blood flow for healthy sexual response. Research shows that 25 to 60% of women experience some kind of sexual dysfunction, especially postmenopausal. Female arousal response is mediated, just like in men, by nitric oxide. Sexual arousal encompasses a variety of physiological responses mediated, including the vasodilation of the clitoral, labial, and vaginal tissues, and increasing blood flow, which leads to better orgasms. And I mentioned this before, but SSRIs, which are very commonly prescribed, will actually inhibit nitric oxide, blocking arousal in both men and women. This is one of the ways that they decrease libido. So another reason, if you are on an SSRI, to make sure you have adequate nitric oxide production. And I mentioned this before too, but steroids and prolactin will inhibit the production of nitric oxide. And we know that sexual health is good health because it enhances intimacy and connection. It increases oxytocin, the love hormone, and endorphins. It decreases stress. It improves cardiovascular health and stamina. It improves immune function, decreases inflammation, and improves sleep. So nitric oxide in the stress response. Adrenals require adequate nitric oxide to function effectively. Cortisol production increases with low nitric oxide, and cortisol production increases with age. So another reason that we need nitric oxide as we age, because we have higher cortisol levels, and that cortisol can cause increased blood glucose, increased A1C, and A1C can actually bind to nitric oxide and decrease as well. So optimal sleep and circadian rhythms. Decreased nitric oxide with aging is associated with impaired circadian rhythms, and REM sleep is such an important thing for emotional well-being, and we know that nitric oxide will actually regulate REM sleep. So I've been challenging patients as I give them nitric oxide precursors to actually look at their data devices like Fitbits and Oura Rings and see if they notice an increase in REM sleep. So nitric oxide and metabolic health. Nitric oxide regulates carbohydrate metabolism and insulin production. Nitric oxide is emerging as a central regulator of energy metabolism and body composition. And impairment of nitric oxide synthase is associated with insulin resistance. How does that happen? Well, insulin resistance decreases eNOS phosphorylation and causes uncoupling. So you have a decrease in endothelial function, one of the reasons why those with diabetes have more cardiovascular risk, and an increase in vascular cell adhesion molecule and other adhesion molecules. The GLUT4 receptor requires adequate nitric oxide to bring glucose into cells. So when that's not working, when there's not adequate nitric oxide, we have more impairment of glucose getting into cells and leading to insulin resistance. And as I mentioned, A1C binds tightly to nitric oxide, rendering it unavailable. So the higher your A1C, the more you're binding up the extra nitric oxide. So cardiovascular health, as we know, you can see on this diagram, I mentioned earlier as well that postmenopausal women have a significantly higher prevalence of abnormal lipids compared to premenopausal counterparts. Part of that is because of decreased nitric oxide production without the hormones. So this, you can see the change with the red line. It crosses over right around the time of menopause, and actually women have a higher risk than men do postmenopausally. And this is some of the mechanisms. So you can see dietary nitrates and nitrites will increase vascular nitric oxide generation, decrease reactive oxygen, decrease inflammation, increase vasodilation, and decrease platelet activation. And all of these things can be very potent preventers of cardiovascular disease and stroke. Nitric oxide and brain health. So there's a link between endothelial function and cognition. Increase in cyclic GMP presents calcium release, and brain-derived BDNF is dependent on cerebral endothelial-derived nitric oxide production. So if we want higher BDNF to protect our brains, we need nitric oxide. Here's a study that talks about brain BDNF levels dependent on cerebrovascular endothelial-derived nitric oxide. So in the endothelial linings, we need that nitric oxide to raise BDNF. And I think, as I'll talk later about some of the ways that we can increase nitric oxide, many of these have also been shown to increase BDNF, and it's probably through that nitric oxide pathway that it's done. Exercise. So exercise induces BDNF production and expression. And guess what? Exercise increases nitric oxide production. So this study postulated that exercise would attenuate cortical atrophy and neuron loss that's common in degeneration, and proposed a link between BDNF, exercise, and cognition through production of nitric oxide. This study talks about how dietary nitrates might be useful in improving regional brain perfusion in older adults in critical brain areas known to be involved in executive function. So getting those dietary nitrate sources may be helpful as we age in cognitive decline. Gut health, I mentioned. So nitric oxide increases mucosal blood flow, mucosal thickening, and prevents microbial infection. So they were presenting in several studies to use nitric oxide precursors, especially along with antibiotics. And if you have any diseases that are related to low mucosal barrier function, like Crohn's or colitis, or any sort of leaky gut situations, that you could use nitric oxide precursors to help heal a leaky gut. These are some of the beneficial actions of nitric oxide on the GI mucosal defense. You can see it reduces degranulation of mast cells. It increases mucus secretion along the epithelium. It supports neutrophils, reduces adherence and secretion. It reduces superoxide radicals on the gut. It accelerates wound healing, vasodilates the blood flow to the gut, and increases formation of new blood vessels. So lots and lots of things that are happening. And you can see here, I didn't specify, but the dotted red line is inhibition on mast cells, macrophages, neutrophils, oxidative stress. And then the blue line is activation on new growth of blood vessels, vasodilation, increases mucus production along the endothelium. And what else does it do? We talked about most of these, but just so we can just reiterate, it increases mucus production and mucosal blood flow, protects development of leaky gut, modulates mucosal immune response, prevents gastric ulcers, repairs NSAID damage, and supports diversity of the microbiome, preventing dysbiosis. So now we're going to shift to how do we actually increase nitric oxide levels. There's lots of things we can do, which is wonderful. Lifestyle factors that support nitric oxide: sunshine, physical activity, green leafy vegetables, and root vegetables. This study showed that physical training increases basal nitric oxide. That's why physical activity is so crucial as we age, especially in hypercholesterolemic patients in this particular study. UV radiation increased production of nitric oxide, so getting a little sunshine or UV radiation from other sources could be helpful for nitric oxide production. Far infrared radiation. So I'm a huge fan of sauna, near and far infrared sauna, and this is one way to also increase endothelial nitric oxide production. All these biohacks, right? This talked about light-induced nitric oxide release in the skin with both UV and blue light, red and near infrared. So the first study was more like red light therapy, and then we have the infrared sauna, and then we have sunshine, all of these methods of increasing nitric oxide production. Hyperbaric oxygen. So this may be one of the methods that it uses for healing. We use it for wound healing, for post-concussion, for PTSD. And one of the ways that it works is enhancing nitric oxide production and enhancing endothelial production because of that increased nitric oxide production. So this is one of the ways that it helps to heal wounds is by increasing nitric oxide blood flow to that wound site. So we can see an increase in healing. Here we go. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy mediates increased nitric oxide production associated with wound healing. And hydrotherapy. So this huge popular hot, cold plunge therapy, hydrotherapy types of things that a lot of people are doing. There is lots of evidence that they also increase our neurotransmitters, their dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, decrease cortisol, but there is also evidence that they may be increasing nitric oxide production. So your cold plunge therapy may be working through increased nitric oxide production. Okay, and before we go to foods and things, and of course there's supplements we can take. We're sponsored by Berkeley Health, and they have a great product that increases nitric oxide production, but it really comes from our foods and food sources. So leafy greens, things like celery, bok choy, spinach, beets, beetroot juices, radishes, turnips, potatoes. These can all be sources of nitrates in the food. And then the bacterial in the oral cavity reduce that nitrate to nitrites. And in the gastric acid milieu, the non-enzymatic reduction from a nitrite to nitric oxide occurs. And then this gas goes right into the vascular system and is absorbed into the intestine and later is excreted by the kidneys. So this is real important, and it comes from food primarily in the intrinsic pathway. So foods that are rich in nitric oxide, of course, we all know beets and beet juice. That's a great way to get nitric oxide. Green leafy vegetables and herbs, red and orange vegetables, stem and root vegetables, turnips and radishes, onion and garlic, bean varieties, eggplant and aubergine. Now, this was an interesting thing as I was studying about nitric oxide that I wanted to share with you, because many of you, like me, probably eat almost all organic produce. And the study that did samples of nitrate-containing foods all across the country literally showed that the organic produce had a much, much lower level than conventional produce, right? This is kind of scary because, again, if the consensus was at the end of that study, which is linked up here if you want to read more about it, was that if we eat all organic, which is like my diet, we are not getting enough nitrites from our food. So we may need to supplement. Now, the perfect world would be is if you had a farm and a garden and you added nitrates to the soil and you produced an organic product that wasn't maybe certified organic, but you could add nitrates. I think the problem is a lot of the organic produce has limitations on what they can actually add to the soil. And whether you get it from a nitrate-rich soil or you add it to the soil, usually that's why there's such a variety of fruits and vegetables across the country. And from LA to New York, there was a dramatic difference in the types of vegetables, and they contain the amounts of nitrates that were found. So just because you're eating these good vegetables doesn't mean you're necessarily getting nitrates. And especially, surprise, surprise, if you're eating organic, right? That was a surprise to me. Okay, so to pull this all together, nitric oxide production dramatically declines with age, especially in women after menopause. We know now that nitric oxide is a signaling molecule that's intricately connected to improve circulation, reduction of inflammation, delivery of oxygen, and regulation of glucose and nutrients to cells. So really, really important for healthy aging, for healthy pleasure, for sexual activity, for our heart, for our lungs, for our brains, all of these organs. And aging is a loss of hormones and depletion of nitric oxide. So this is absolutely related to some of the things that we see with women and aging. So if you want to learn more, I'd encourage you to check out Berkeley Life because they have some of the great precursor products that can help with these patients. So thank you so much tonight. If you want an update, updates from me or copies of my slides, you can text Healthy Me, all one word, to 66866 to be subscribed to my newsletter, and I will send all of you who subscribe tonight a copy of these slides. Thank you so much. Okay, and I think we're on to a panel discussion. Looking forward to that.
Well, here we are at that place in our courses that I'm most excited about, the chance to actually have a free-flowing conversation with our faculty. And of course, we've got two extraordinary faculty members who already benefited from their presentations, Dr. Chris Easton, and really one of the scientists par excellence to tell us about nitrate supplementation, periodicity, and activity of nitric oxide, its effects in physical performance, and then Dr. Jill Carnahan, whose reputation within the functional medicine community as one of our really leading clinicians in taking information, bringing it down into news to use at the clinical level. So with that, Chris and Jill, let me jump into it and say, Chris, there's something about periodicity, circadian rhythms around nitric oxide. Is nitric oxide influenced by mealtime? Is nitric oxide influenced by activity? Is nitric oxide influenced by sleep cycling? Could you give us a little bit of insight as to kind of the temporal nature of nitric oxide?
Sure, yeah, and the brief answer is yes to almost all those questions that you asked there. I think one of the fascinating things about nitric oxide is it is subject to so many different influences. So our body's capacity to produce nitric oxide will vary depending on the time of day, our posture, environmental conditions, including temperature, altitude, and sunlight exposure. And we know that nitric oxide production, for example, declines with aging, and therefore increasing the body's capacity to produce nitric oxide likely becomes important as we age. In terms of our production of nitric oxide through nitrate supplementation, whether that is subject to those circadian influences that you mentioned, the time of day effects, that's still to be determined. I know some groups are actively working on that right now. So I expect within a year or so, we should be able to answer that question more definitively.
Thank you. So translating, Jill, over to you and your theater of influence and expertise, there are sometimes considered gender-specific effects of different types of nutritional support programs. We think about hormone replacement therapy as being one of those, but does nitric oxide have a role in women's health that may help differentiate it somewhat in terms of its relationship to overall health patterns in both genders?
Yes, Jeff, and this is so appropriate as a woman over 40 myself. As I dove into the research, I was really surprised. I know we've all mentioned the power of nitric oxide, and really, I feel like this is one of the absolute keys to aging healthily, like maybe the number one thing. It could be that high up. And so women, what happens is over the age of 40, all of us, men and women, decrease production by about 50%. After the age of 60, it goes down to about 15%. So it's very, very relevant as we age. And even more important is that with cardiovascular health, which nitric oxide has everything to do with endothelial health and cardiovascular function, what happens with women is as we hit menopause, as I mentioned in my presentation, we outpace men in heart disease. So to me, this is the missing link of why women after the age of menopause are having more cardiovascular risk than men at the same age.
So as we, and this would go to both of you, so maybe you can both take a shot at this question. As we look at the ability to improve nitric oxide status in the body, knowing that nitric oxide is produced by a variety of different forms, isoforms of nitric oxide synthase. And I talked in my presentation about the three forms of nitric oxide synthase. With the nitric oxide synthase, it's so-called iNOS, immune inducible, is inducible, and others are more constitutive. Do we, when we supplement with, say, nitrate or a nitric oxide stimulant supplement, are we affecting all of those types of nitric oxide synthase, or are we seeing differential effects? You know, what's the cell specificity of our supplementation program? So, Chris, maybe I'll jump over to you first, if you give us some thoughts about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the interesting thing about nitrate and nitrite supplementation is it involves a different pathway. You bypass the nitric oxide synthase pathways. And a lot of my research now is actually focused on that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway, which involves the activity of the bacteria that reside in the oral cavity. So when we ingest nitrate, it's swallowed, it's absorbed into the circulation and re-enters the mouth, where certain species of bacteria can break down the nitrate. They reduce the nitrate to nitrite. And when we swallow the nitrite, it's then converted into bioactive nitric oxide. So the fascinating thing here is that, you know, we are in that symbiotic relationship with bacteria that reside in our mouth. But importantly, that represents a different pathway by which the body can produce nitric oxide that isn't reliant on those nitric oxide synthase pathways. Jill mentioned earlier the reduction in nitric oxide production as we age. And so there is another mechanism by which we can actually increase nitric oxide levels.
That's a really, really important point, I think, for the viewer of this program, because in the past we've been told, and I think rightly so, that the precursors to nitric oxide are coming out of the urea cycle, arginine, for instance, and then that's broken down as a substrate by the nitric oxide synthase. So in this particular case, we're talking about an effect that really is kind of divorced from the first thoughts that we had about the production of nitric oxide, which were coming through the amino acid metabolism. So I want to emphasize that out to kind of maybe give a little bit more, because that may be a point that people don't fully understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, the discovery of that second pathway is something we've only known about for, you know, the last 20 years or so, and it's such an important discovery in the context of human health, because now all of a sudden we're starting to understand why a diet that's rich in green leafy vegetables is really good for our cardiovascular health. We're starting to understand why there are links between our oral health and our cardiovascular health, you know, and so those things are starting to come together now, and it's likely, you know, because of the role of nitric oxide. And you know, I would agree fully with Jill's comment earlier on about the importance of nitric oxide in our health.
Yeah, Dr. Blind, I would love to comment on this.
I'd like to jump. Yeah, please do.
I was just going to say, so fascinating to me as I dove into the research, because for years we've been using arginine and citrulline as precursors. But what I see with the complex chronic disease of infectious and toxic burden is so many people have massive oxidative stress. And as Dr. Easton mentioned, what happens when you have oxidative stress is, of course, you're converting this, you're oxidizing this, and it's no good. So to me, it was a big aha that the food and the nitric oxide supplements are actually a much safer source for my patients who have oxidative stress. And then further, food is wonderful. We know some of the high food contents are the root vegetables like beets, especially, but turnip, arugula, celery, bok choy, spinach. But a couple of things come into play here. A lot of my patients have high oxalates, and most of those foods I mentioned are high in oxalate, so they can't tolerate that oxalate burden. And the most shocking thing I found as I was doing my presentation, which I mentioned, but I want to say again now, is the organic conundrum. You saw that study that I presented, and the study showed that because I come from a farm in Illinois, so I know how this works, they add nitrates to the soil so that their crops will actually have more nitrate-rich fibers. And what happens is with organics, certified organics, they cannot add that to the soil. So the truth is, if you're eating an all organic diet, you are not getting enough nitrates, period. The study showed that. That was a shocker to me because I eat almost 100% organic. So this was very relevant to me as a consumer to say, oh my goodness, I'm not getting nitrates. And there we go back to the supplementation as maybe being a real key player.
I think that was beautifully stated. And one of the things I want to follow up on that is for some people, and I've heard this conversation, they're worried about, because they heard nitrite and they think of nitrosamines and they think of smoked meats and processed meats and they think of nitrosamine-induced cancer risk. And you're an expert in environmental toxins and in the whole nature of things that are not so good for us to be exposed. How do we communicate to people the concept of the nitrites, nitrate story so that they don't worry about nitrosamines?
Yeah, Chris, I would love your biochemical input here, but from my clinical perspective, when we're getting these fruits and vegetables, now you can think about, we've had the DASH diet around forever. And part of the reason that works for blood pressure is it includes 5 or more servings of nitrate-rich fruits and vegetables. And that's really the basis of the DASH diet. So we've had this, and the evidence around that is very powerful, because one of the things, obviously, with endothelial dysfunction, which creates less nitric oxide production as we age, is blood pressure goes up. That's one of the key symptoms. So if your blood pressure is going up, you have nitric oxide issues. If you're over the age of 40, you have nitric oxide issues. So that includes most of us. And so knowing that, and then knowing these foods as sources, really, I really guess the research speaks for itself, because we know that the DASH diet and these things have worked for years and in a very safe way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The endothelial, the epidemiological evidence, I think, is pretty telling. That those with a diet that's high in nitrate seem to be at less risk for cardiovascular disease and stroke and many other non-communicable diseases. And I think the suggestion is that the vehicle by which nitrate's delivered is important. So vegetables don't just contain nitrate; they contain lots of other bioactive components, and a combination of those components seems to be protective in terms of metabolism of that nitrate. So when we break it down, the end product aren't necessarily the things that potentially underpin cancer risk.
Well, thank you. I think that's a really important message to people who may have had some concern. You're an expert, obviously, in the physiology and physical performance aspects of nitric oxide. I noticed there are a number of studies that have been published recently, even in 2023, that are looking at strength conditioning athletes and as well as endurance athletes. Could you fill us in a little bit about your kind of snapshot on nitric oxide and physical performance?
Sure, and my whole interest in nitrate and nitric oxide stemmed from a publication in 2009 that showed if you drink a pint of beetroot juice, you're able to exercise 16% longer. Which I thought was fascinating and surprising to some extent. So my background is a sports scientist, and one of my research interests is how we can help athletes perform to their best, whether that's strength athletes, power athletes, endurance athletes. Overall, I think if we were to take a kind of snapshot of the research, there is some inconsistencies in what the research tells us. But altogether, I think there is some really good evidence that nitrate supplementation is beneficial for various forms of exercise performance. And again, we're pretty certain that the consequences of that are a result of nitric oxide, whether that be through direct action on the muscle, increasing contractile force, therefore increasing force production, reducing the oxygen requirement of the mitochondria within the cell, which obviously might be beneficial for endurance performance. And there's some limited evidence, potentially something of relevance, is an increase in muscle blood flow during exercise as well.
And in exercising athletes, is there a different dose that one thinks about in terms of supplementation, or what's the range of dosing that looks like it's valuable?
Yeah, this has been subject to some debate over the last few years, and there are some who would argue that a longer supplementation period is necessary because there is some suggestion that the beneficial effects of nitrate on exercise performance may be a consequence of changes in protein expression in the muscle, for example, and therefore a longer supplementation period is required to elicit those changes. But some of the other mechanisms that I mentioned earlier can be readily achieved through acute doses. So the typical nitrate supplementation protocol for an athlete may be 2.5 hours before exercise, which is sufficient time for the nitrate to be absorbed recirculated back in the mouth, broken down to nitrite and then nitric oxide. So it would coincide with the peak levels of nitric oxide after ingestion.
So Jill, when you have a patient come in, what are you looking for as a potential sign of nitric oxide insufficiency?
Well, of course, age, as we mentioned, that's a no-brainer. And then, of course, if they have blood pressure issues, symptoms of, difficulty with exercise tolerance, difficulty with sustaining activity. More and more we're seeing in the last several years, exercise intolerance as a symptom of either post-viral or post-infectious or other issues. And I think this is a real key player in helping people recover. A recent study I saw out of Stanford said that 1 in 3 people were experiencing post-COVID long symptoms. And so this is relevant to that, especially because to me, COVID affects the endothelium. All the research that I've seen is it's an inflammatory disorder that actually affects our endothelium. So what are we going to do? I think nitric oxide is absolutely key, healing the endothelium through glycocalyx support. Plus, nitric oxide is my #1 strategy to heal these patients. And someone like me who's been dealing with tick-borne infections and mold-related illness far before COVID, to me, it's the same types of pattern we see with toxic load plus infectious burden.
Can one use the salivary test strips as a way of assessing at least surrogate markers for nitric oxide status?
Yeah, and I've been doing that in clinic. I have them by my desk. I'm like, let's try this and see. And I would say 90% of people, especially our people over the age of 40, are coming out with a very low level of pink in their strips, which means there's no nitric oxide production. And I'll literally, while I'm in the visit, give them a sample to try. And then within 30 minutes, we can see the change on the detection of their tongue. Now, one thing I mentioned before, but I think is kind of funny because I was someone who used mouthwash before I prepared this lecture. And because of the antibacterial effect that decreases that conversion in the mouth, I no longer use mouthwash.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And sometimes we think we're doing good only to find later that whoop, maybe there are unexpected consequences. So one of the things that many women are doing is supplementing with various types of hormone modulating agents. Is there any contraindication or any synergy that occurs between nitric oxide and female hormones?
Well, what happens as we lose our estrogen is we have more procoagulable states. We become a little bit more prone to clot for various reasons. So in my mind, as we replace that estrogen back, we get back a level of whether it's brain function or just sexual function or exercise tolerance or sleep. All of these things come. But adding that nitric oxide is, to me, the missing link with postmenopausal women, because not only do you have that replacing, a bioidentical level of their hormones so that they can function better in those ways, you're also enhancing their endothelial function, decreasing their cardiovascular risk, decreasing their stroke risk, decreasing their blood pressure, increasing exercise intolerance. One thing in clinic as well that I'm sure, Dr. Easton, you mentioned before that I find fascinating is there's studies on infrared sauna, sunlight, hyperbaric oxygen, and guess what? This hot new topic of cold plunge, all of these have evidence that those mechanisms by which they might be working is through production of nitric oxide, at least to some extent.
Oh, so let's flip it over to you, Chris. Take it from there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And one thing about living in Scotland is, as you can tell from my accent, is that we don't get as much sunlight as maybe a lot of other folks in the cardiovascular disease in Scotland. And of course, part of that is down to levels of inactivity, sedentary behaviour, and diet. But there is a suggestion that the latitude at which a person lives, the distance from the equator, may actually be linked to cardiovascular health outcomes as well. And I think we've always suspected that it's perhaps a temperature issue, warmer temperature, wider blood vessels, lower blood pressure, lower. But we've just published a paper in the last year where we tracked the seasonal changes in nitric oxide metabolites and we saw the expected change in vitamin D, and we all know the vitamin D story, sunlight and equals vitamin D production. But we've shown for the first time that nitric oxide levels are lower in the winter compared to the summer. And I think that's a really important point, because we know more people die of heart attacks, of strokes in the winter and compared to the summer, this kind of seasonal risk pattern. And I think our data, while preliminary, perhaps suggests that that might be implicated by nitric oxide levels.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because there are a series of papers that have been published, I know you're familiar with, that show synergy between vitamin D and nitric oxide. And it's interesting to note that MS is associated with higher latitudes, lower sun exposure. And so we've thought of that in part as a vitamin D related condition. I'm thinking of Terry Walls and a variety of people that have really helped us to understand that. But now we're starting to see maybe a nitric oxide connection as well. And in fact, it's interesting, there's a couple of reports I saw that show that MS may be a nitric oxide insufficiency related condition, or where it would respond very nicely to nitric oxide stimulation. But something like rheumatoid arthritis, and actually nitric oxide may have an exacerbating effect of the inflammation. So it seems like there's some different differential effects of nitric oxide in different autoimmune disorders. I'm not sure if that's fully fleshed out yet, but it is, I know, an interesting discussion in the literature.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, again, is part of the complexity of nitric oxide, that in some cases, increased nitric oxide does reflect that increased inflammation, and it's a consequence of the disease. And the nitric oxide isn't bioactive in the form that we would hope it would be in terms of being protective and beneficial for health, because it is converted to other forms that are potentially damaging and exacerbate the conditions of the disease. Going back to that point on vitamin D, I think one of the interesting things there is that perhaps we've been focused on the wrong thing, right? So we measure vitamin D and see in some cases it's increased, some cases it's decreased, and we put two and two together and think, well, okay, let's supplement those patients with vitamin D and see what happens. But a lot of the large clinical studies show very limited effects of vitamin D supplementation. So perhaps vitamin D is a biomarker. It's a biomarker of those changes. It's a biomarker of sunlight exposure. But what we've been missing is measuring nitric oxide and nitric oxide metabolites, because perhaps that has more powerful physiological effects. So perhaps the supplementation has been with the wrong thing.
Brilliant.
Oh, really fascinating. Jill, please.
One more thought on that. Jeff, you and I have talked frequently about autoimmunity used to begin in the gut, and now we've both said before autoimmunity maybe begins in the soils. Now I have some thoughts, because nitric oxide begins in the soils, right? So what if there was a connection, because we know that nitric oxide is essential for healthy gut function, which I didn't get a chance. I could have talked a whole hour on that. But the key is that it increases mucosal integrity and barrier protection. It helps with diversity of the gut. And we're not even talking about the gut, but that's where the ground zero is for autoimmunity. And again, as we talked about, soil depletion or a lack of additive of nitrates to the soil is affecting the food production of nitric oxide. And so back to our first postulation of nitric oxide and autoimmunity maybe begins back in the soil.
I think that was absolutely brilliant. I so appreciate you bringing that up, because again, we talk about systems and how these systems, we're part of a system and interfacing with the systems, and there are certain communicating things that cut through the system, of which nitric oxide is one. Also polyphenols from our diet share that, and polyphenols and nitric oxide are interconnected too in the human physiology. Maybe one of you wanted to just to take a ping at that, because we now see that there's an interrelationship between dietary polyphenols and nitric oxide production as well. And maybe Chris, you wanted to say a quick word on that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's not something that I would confess to being an expert in, but you're absolutely right. Jill mentioned earlier the different forms of nitrate, and beetroot juice is one that we would, as standard use in a lot of our research studies. And so the interaction of those bioactive compounds, as I mentioned earlier, is part for me of that story. It's not just about the nitrates; it is the interaction with polyphenols and those other bioactive components within those products. Yeah.
So Jill, you've done a really great job of helping us to see the vascular positive influences of nitric oxide with what used to be called endothelial relaxing factor and the vasoactive components to relax the vessels, lower the blood pressure. What are the other clinical kind of places where you would see positive impact of improved nitric oxide outcome? You also spoke about neuronal function and brain perfusion, and therefore cognitive function. Are there places that we should be thinking that clinicians should be aware of that nitric oxide plays an important role?
Yes. And, you know, again, as I dove into the literature, an hour wasn't even close to enough time to cover all the many, many aspects. I focused on women and aging. That's because I'm one of those women. And I think we don't often give women enough importance in the research and literature, although things are shifting. But there's other places, absolutely, with brain health, with dementia risk, with increasing in BDNF in the brain. Cardiovascular we've touched on, and that's absolutely critical with endothelial function, nitric oxide, vasodilation, decreasing blood pressure, decreasing stroke risks, increasing exercise tolerance. We mentioned the gut, absolutely integral in the gut mucosal barrier and integrity of the gut lining and increasing diversity. And there's some studies that show it may actually protect against antibiotic-associated side effects. Other ways that this can enhance metabolically, it has a profound impact on insulin resistance and metabolic disease. So on a whole nother landscape, prevention of diabetes, increasing in insulin sensitivity, and which exercise, of course, is helping as well. So these things all play together. I will tell you, as I looked at systems, there was not one system that I came across that wasn't affected positively by nitric oxide.
Oh, there we go. Well, I want to stand up just for a second because we've been focusing on women's health, but I'm going to jump over to Chris here. What about sildenafil? What about nitric oxide as it relates to erectile dysfunction? That's going over to the male side of the equation and looking at the positive effects of nitric oxide as well. Maybe you want to make just a quick comment about that role as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, I think we can list endlessly the positive effects of nitric oxide on human physiology, and you know, thinking about the impact that discovery's had on our population, you know, and you know, from a mechanistic perspective, we've talked about blood flow and increasing blood flow. Nitric oxide we know promotes smooth muscle relaxation and blood flow to different regions of the body. And yeah, the discovery, it's called Viagra in the UK, you know, for sure has been hugely important. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me. I recall in 1998 when nitric oxide was the molecule of the year on the cover of Science magazine. And a lot of people thought, okay, that's great for you nerds, those chemistry nerds. I mean, so it's a molecule of the year, Yahoo. But then suddenly we started to recognize that this molecule of the year transmits messages throughout the whole of the body. And it's a cellular communicator that is deficient in many individuals that then leads to a tie-up in a road jam on the freeways of life and creates dysfunction downstream. So I think that the two of you have really brought this topic from the esotericism of the chemistry of nitric oxide to its extraordinary physiological importance. And to think of a molecule that's so small having such a huge heavy lifting effect on physiology, when we used to think that blood pressure was controlled by these big proteins, endothelial relaxing factor was probably some polypeptide that had, you know, huge macromolecular structure. But now we see a small molecule like nitric oxide having all these extraordinary, very tissue-specific effects. So Jill, when you talk to your patients about this, how do you start them down the road to improve their nitric oxide levels?
Well, the great thing is pretty much any complaint they come in with, nitric oxide is probably going to, whether it's memory issues or dementia or insulin resistance or gut integrity or autoimmunity. And we didn't even mention the toxic load and its effect on decreasing nitric oxide production, which is kind of my specialty. So whether it's mold-related illness, and that's one in particular where you're going to have that other pathway just oxidize your nitric oxide and cause more damage than good. So when I'm talking to patients, basically we're asking about, you know, function, brain, exercise, activities of daily living. And for women, as you just mentioned with men, one important thing as we age is sexual function. And this is absolutely because there's been so much research focused on men and medications for men, women haven't had as many options to enhance sexual function and blood flow. And this is beautiful because it works in men and women that way. So if anyone is not interested, you just talk about sex and they're usually more interested.
So Is there a starting dose that you think of as it relates to nitrate, or is it a combination with using things like beets and other nitrate-containing vegetables? What's the clinical approach that you like to start a patient on?
Yeah, so I love the Berkeley Life. It was one of our sponsors. I usually give the foundational, it's Nitric Oxide Foundation, 2 caps in the morning. Pretty much everyone who would be taking this, if they are an athlete or they're needing more performance enhancing effects, you can absolutely do 2 twice a day. And of course, I'm always encouraging them to increase the nitrate-rich vegetables. But as I mentioned, the organic conundrum makes most of my patients who eat all organic actually on the risk factor for not getting enough in their diet.
Chris, over on the other side, is there any concern about too much nitrate? Is everything seems to have a threshold? Is there any issue on the upside?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we have the answer to that yet, because I don't think we have studies where we've deliberately supplemented with nitrate over prolonged periods of time to have a real clear answer on whether there are any additional risk factors. One, we have had some very, very isolated cases of gastrointestinal upsets from using things like beetroot juice, and likely because of that kind of smooth muscle relaxation effects. There are some suggestions, for example, if someone has low blood pressure already, that might be contraindicated by taking nitric oxide products. But I think the side effects that we've seen and that are reported are very, very minimal. So I think we can so far be fairly confident in prescribing that to either patients or to athletes.
Well, I think the two of you have given us just a plethora of news to use, of really important things that are not just kind of esotericisms, but really clinically important to get people back on a track of metabolic balance. Dr. Chris Easton, Dr. Jill Carnahan, 2 extraordinary resource tools and individuals who I think we can say come with the facts that can be delivered effectively to patients. I want to thank Berkeley Life very much for their advocacy and also their sponsorship and partnership with Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute. This is really what PLI stands for, trying to bring clinically useful information with high integrity to clinicians so that they can do the best job they can possibly do in delivering positive health outcomes in their patients. And so both Chris and Jill, thanks so much for your contributions in many ways, but certainly to this program. Thank you, Berkeley Life, and thank all of you that have listened, and I hope you'll share this information with your colleagues. There's a lot of important takeaways from this that can value patients as we apply this information clinically. Thanks so much, and thanks for being with the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Education series. We really appreciate it.